Imagine risking your life to smuggle sanctioned Russian oil, only to find out you're not getting paid on time, or worse, not getting paid at all. As of September, unpaid wages across Russia have reached around 1.64 billion rubles, roughly 17 million US dollars. That's more than 1 billion rubles higher than last year, nearly triple that of what it was 12 months ago.
Russia is certainly quickly feeling the impact of sanctions hitting their country, with U.S. now freezing assets of Russia's central bank, and the Russian ruble is crashing in value.
Some of Russia's biggest industrial companies are putting employees on furlough or cutting staff as the war economy slows down.
Russia's metal industry is facing a wave of layoffs and reduced working hours as demand slumps and financial pressures mount.
Russian workers are now going to unimaginable lengths just to get the money they've already earned. In October, more than 60 desperate workers at a major power plant climbed onto the building's roof, threatening to jump unless management immediately handed over the pay they were owed. Imagine being so overwhelmed by months of struggle and hunger that they chose to put their lives at risk rather than continue being ignored. Even Russia's most successful companies are going under. Arosa, the world's largest diamond company by volume, first reduced employee pay by 10%. Just a couple of months later, it completely shut down operations at several mines. Then last month, in October, an entire crew aboard a sanctioned Russian oil tanker refused to sail. They had been working for months without pay. Eventually, Russian authorities had no choice but to detain the tanker at the port of Murmansk. It turned out that the 20 crew members hadn't received any money in over 4 months, with nearly $100,000 in unpaid wages owed to them by the ship's captain. Now, these shadow fleet tankers have single-handedly kept Russia's economy afloat for the past 3 years by illegally shipping sanctioned oil. But when even the hands feeding your economy aren't getting fed themselves, that's when you know you've got a major crisis. In this video, we'll see why major Russian factories are already shutting down, and why thousands of workers are being left unpaid. Putin's wartime economy is clearly hitting a dangerous breaking point. But just how bad is it going to get? Can this economic crisis become severe enough to finally push Putin into ending his war in Ukraine? Or will ordinary Russians be left to pick up the pieces? If you thought this wage crisis was limited only to sectors like oil, coal, and electricity due to sanctions and drone strikes, you'd be mistaken. That's really just the tip of the iceberg. In fact, the single biggest wage backlogs belongs to a major road construction company. They haven't paid their 3,600 employees since March, piling up 608 million rubles, about $8 million, in unpaid wages. This single company alone accounts for more than 35% of Russia's officially reported unpaid wages. Yet, we could easily name dozens of other companies whose combined wage debts far exceed the official figures Putin wants us to believe. For example, an industrial equipment supplier in the Kemerovo region has left its workers hanging with 65 million rubles, about $800,000, in unpaid wages. Similarly, a food services company called Rassvet in the Tula region owes over 36 million rubles, about $450,000, to its staff. According to Russia's trade unions, the actual nationwide debt likely surpasses 2.4 billion rubles, double the official numbers and 5 times higher than last year. You see, during the first year of the war in 2022, many Russians saw their paychecks increase significantly. A labor shortage caused by mobilization to the front lines, coupled with massive government spending on the military, meant defense factories started working around the clock and paying premium wages just to keep operations running. Soldiers and their families received large payouts, and military contractors generously rewarded workers who met tough production goals. Officially, incomes across Russia rose by nearly 6% in 2023, outpacing inflation for the first time in years. Ordinary Russians who had long struggled financially suddenly had more cash than ever. Even poorer regions experienced an economic boost as defense factories sprang to life, flush with non-stop orders. But that boom turned out to be nothing more than a sugar rush. By mid-2023, the cracks were already beginning to show. Factories couldn't find enough workers or even the basic capacity needed to keep up with the government's impossible military demands. Unemployment hit a record low of just 2.1%, which might sound fantastic until you realize it wasn't due to genuine economic health. Tens of thousands of able-bodied men were no longer in the regular workforce. Instead, they were being drafted into a war that many didn't even believe in. while countless others were stuck working exhausting overtime shifts in defense factories. Putin proudly bragged about this artificially low unemployment rate as a clear proof of his economic success, even though his own economic advisors were warning him that Russia's economy was starting to stagnate. The situation was becoming desperate enough that the Russian central bank felt forced to step in. Between the summer and fall of 2023, they hiked the key interest rate from 16% all the way up to 21%, the highest it had been in over 2 decades. The goal was to cool down rising inflation by making borrowing more expensive, thereby slowing down spending and cooling off overheated sectors of the economy. And yes, it did work, maybe even a little too well. Inflation rates began stabilizing, and prices for everyday goods finally stopped climbing. But the consequences of such high interest rates turned out to be just as damaging as the problems they were trying to fix. Companies that relied heavily on borrowed money to keep their businesses running or to expand suddenly found themselves facing huge increases in the cost of their debt. This forced many businesses to stop hiring, scale back production, delay wages, or even shut down altogether. The GDP growth, which had been over 4.3% in 2024, has slowed to just about 0.7 to 1% this year. Those massive interest rate hikes mean companies are seeing their monthly interest payments jump by 30 to 70%. With limited options, companies must choose between defaulting on their loans or delaying wages. Defaulting isn't really an option since it would obliterate their access to future credit and likely doom their entire business. As a result, many companies have decided to delay wages. On one hand, the central bank's punishing 20% interest rate is suffocating businesses. On the other, international sanctions and a cooling global economy have significantly reduced demand for key Russian exports, such as steel, coal, and timber. Even within Russia, there is a lot less money going around. People are earning less, many have lost their jobs, and most simply can't afford to buy as much as they used to. According to the Russian government's own statistics, approximately 1/3 of Russian enterprises are now unprofitable. Out of 20 major manufacturing sectors, only 4 are still growing, and 3 of those are directly linked to military and arms production. Clearly, business outside Russia's war-related industries are either on the verge of collapse or barely managing to survive. That's why even the small 1% GDP growth figure probably isn't real. In fact, 67 out of Russia's 89 regions have already run out of their yearly budget in the first half of 2025. Take the Komi Republic, for example, a region that relies heavily on mining. In early 2025, income tax revenues there dropped nearly 54% compared to the previous year. Neighboring Chelyabinsk, a major steel and manufacturing hub, saw revenues drop by 1/3. Local governments across Russia are scraping together whatever remains in their budgets merely to pay essential workers, like school teachers, doctors, and nurses. In many small towns, hundreds of families depend entirely on a single factory or mine to survive. But now, with so many of these businesses shutting down, entire communities risk losing their livelihoods almost overnight. Take this plywood mill in western Siberia, for instance. It's operated by Svetsa, one of Russia's biggest wood product companies. With everyday prices rising and wages stagnant or falling, buying furniture became the last thing on people's minds. Naturally, demand collapsed, and the mill had to shut down. Overnight, more than 300 people lost their jobs. The company gave almost no warning and offered no immediate plan for the workers' future. Worse yet, it likely had wage debts of its own. Coal was once the backbone of Russia's economy, and after oil, it still is. But now, in 2025, even the coal industry is struggling. Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak personally informed President Putin that at least 30 coal mines are on the verge of bankruptcy. Local officials in the Kuzbass region, home to some of the world's richest coal deposits, reported that 18 out of the 151 mines and open pit sites have already shut down this year. With Europe completely shunning Russian coal and China only buying at rock-bottom prices, mines are closing down almost every month. By April of 2025, nearly 19,000 coal workers had already lost their jobs. Staggering numbers for an industry that employs about 150,000 people in total. And for most of those miners, there's nowhere else to go. Only 2,400 managed to transfer to other mines or industries. The rest are stuck unemployed, in towns where coal was often the only source of jobs. Unemployment like this might be one of the nails in Putin's coffin. Imagine seeing 30 towns going on strike almost overnight. How do you even control something like that? Plus, Russia still carries the trauma of the unemployment chaos of the 1990s. Back then, after the Soviet Union collapsed, unpaid wages and mass strikes were a way of life. In 1998, coal miners even blocked the Trans-Siberian Railway because they hadn't been paid in months. Vladimir Putin rose to power promising to end exactly that kind of humiliation. And to his credit, he mostly did. During the oil booms of the 2000s, the government steadily cleared wage debts and pensions. Getting paid on time became normal again. That's why today's sudden turnaround feels like such a shock. A whole generation of Russians grew up under Putin's stability with dependable wages, only to see that security vanish overnight. But this time, it's not just miners or factory workers. Teachers, nurses, and civil servants across different regions have started reporting delayed salaries too. From railways and automobiles to metals, coal, diamond, and cement, some of Russia's biggest industrial companies are choosing to force their workers into part-time rather than fire them completely. Russia's biggest car maker, with roughly 40,000 workers, Avtovaz, switched to a 4-day work week at the end of September to cut costs, meaning a 20% salary cut for everyone. Truck maker Kamaz and the Gorky auto plant did the same thing during the summer. From the company's perspectives, a car assembly line worker needs months of training. A veteran steelmaker or mining engineer is even harder to replace. So firms are reluctant to lose human capital that they might desperately need later, hoping that the war ends before they go bankrupt. Even Russian Railways, the huge state-owned company with around 700,000 employees, has asked workers to take extra unpaid days off each month just to cut costs. Clearly, these industries aren't avoiding layoffs out of kindness. They're under serious political pressure from Putin and social pressures from their own workers. But sometimes, even going on strike isn't an option. Early in the war, over 1,000 migrant workers from Central Asia building a high-rise complex in Moscow went on strike because they hadn't been paid in 4 months. The construction giant Crocus Group, owned by a powerful oligarch, responded by having security forces fire shots into the air to break up the protest. And remember, this happened in February of 2023. Just 1 year into the war, workers were already 4 months unpaid in Russia's richest city. If things were that absurd, then imagine how desperate the situation must be across Russia now. Throughout this economic crisis, China has been backstabbing Russia for its own profit. Sure, this relationship with China has somewhat helped keep Russia afloat, but nearly every month, Xi Jinping finds ways to squeeze Putin for even more favorable deals. China pays the bare minimum for Russian imports, whether it's gas, coal, steel, or uranium, and at the same time floods the Russian market with cheap goods, intentionally driving local businesses to collapse, thus setting the stage for Chinese companies to dominate the market and form monopolies once the war finally ends. One sector, however, had seemed invincible throughout all of these issues: the defense industry. It was the last place anyone expected to see words like budget cuts. Arms factories and military suppliers have been the backbone of Russia's war economy, with military spending sometimes accounting for as much as 30% of the national budget. Yet, shockingly, in August of 2025, salaries for arms workers dropped by 10% for the first time since the war began, simply because even the defense plants had reached their limits. Deputy Industry Minister Vasily Osmakov admitted that the economy had reached a turning point where throwing more bodies at the problem wasn't working. By 2023, munitions plants had already maxed out shifts and staffing. There was simply no more room to expand. Apart from specific areas like drone manufacturing, which is still strong due to ongoing war demands, defense companies no longer need to offer substantial raises to attract skilled workers. But slashing spending in defense will have severe consequences, and there's very little that the Russian government could do to counter it without risking serious unrest. Managing downturns in civilian industries has historically been far simpler. For instance, during the 2008-2009 financial crisis, Moscow poured money into car manufacturers and Russian railways to avoid mass layoffs. During COVID-19, and again when sanctions hit in 2023, authorities instructed factories to retain workers, even if it meant paying employees to stay idle, just to keep unemployment numbers from spiraling out of control. But these measures are temporary band-aids, not lasting solutions. They might buy some time, but they can't fix the fundamental issue, which is why the wage issue started in 2024 and is worsening month by month. And solving this isn't nearly as easy when it comes to the defense sector. Defense contracts are usually long-term, multi-million-dollar commitments. When a government suddenly reduces defense orders, entire chains of suppliers, from steel mills to electronics manufacturers, feel the hit almost immediately. These specialized companies can't just shift overnight to other products or markets. They've invested heavily in equipment, training, and factories, tailored specifically for defense production. On top of that, defense spending fuels critical technological development and innovation, areas essential for Russia to remain militarily competitive. Remember, before this war, Russia used to be one of the top 2 exporters of arms globally. From 2019 to 2023, it accounted for around 11% of global arms exports. And once this war ends, Russia will probably try exporting weapons again, just like it does with oil. But it's hard to imagine who would actually buy them, given how badly these same weapons have been performing on the battlefield. So the longer Russia's war economy keeps draining resources away from everything else, the worse the stagnation will become. Russia has already spent a big part of its emergency savings just to pay for the war and to keep key industries afloat. In the first 6 months of 2025 alone, the Kremlin spent an astonishing 8.5 trillion rubles, around $100 billion, on defense. And if wages are still being cut despite this massive spending, then honestly, it's hard to imagine what could possibly save Russia's defense industry now. All the while, the ruble's value keeps falling, making every problem we've talked about and hundreds more so much worse. But perhaps the biggest issue right now is that regions across Russia are also slashing payments to contract soldiers. In Tatarstan, payouts have dropped from 3.1 million rubles to just 800,000, which is nearly 75% off the original amount. Mariel, Chuvashia, Belgorod, and Nizhny Novgorod have seen the same thing, some even going as low as 500,000 rubles. Imagine risking your life at 5 to 1 odds for just around $6,000. That's how bad things have gotten. It's not hard to see why the entire economy is slowly collapsing week by week. For now, the Kremlin can paper over the numbers, maybe for a few months or maybe even a year, and ordinary Russians might grit their teeth and carry on. But the longer this war drags on, and the more resources the government pulls away from regular economic activity, the more stories of unpaid wages that we'll hear. Every delayed paycheck, every factory forced into a 4-day work week, every family skipping meals while dad waits for his boss to sort out the payment issues, each one adds another hit to Russia's economy. So, can Putin's regime keep fighting the war and maintain economic stability at home, or will something eventually have to give? Until now, the Kremlin has tried its best to shield the general population from the war's direct economic impact, or at least delay it. They flooded the economy with money in 2022 and 2023. They mobilized soldiers primarily from poorer and remote regions to avoid angering people in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And they crushed dissent forcefully. For a long time, many Russians could live as though their special military operation was something distant that didn't affect their everyday lives. But now that is changing. You can't keep an economy in a state of permanent, resource-draining war and not expect it to eventually hit a breaking point. And that breaking point is the Russian citizens. Some are literally threatening to end their lives or starve just to get the wages they're owed. They watched factories padlock their gates and mines slowly flood with groundwater, realizing that no one's coming to help. Remember, these aren't activist-led political protests about democracy or foreign policy. They are outbursts of anger over survival. No propaganda can explain that away. A man who cannot feed his family after working 12 hours a day will not care about NATO or denazification. If this keeps going for just a few more months, Putin could face a wave of anger that even his repressive system cannot contain. It has not reached this point yet, but it's getting pretty close. But at the same time, it's also possible, perhaps even likely, that ordinary Russians will be left to suffer while the war goes on. Putin has mastered the art of deflecting blame and suppressing dissent. State media can easily redirect public anger towards local officials or company bosses, portraying them as corrupt or incompetent, rather than admitting the problems are systemic. We've already seen prosecutors step up to investigate plant managers over unpaid wages, as if it's just a few corrupt bosses causing the problem and not the system itself. The Kremlin could double down on such scapegoating, sacrificing a few oligarchs or regional governors to appease public anger, while keeping the war machine grinding on. As a result, the poverty rate, which Putin worked to reduce in the 2000s, is likely creeping up again, though official statistics will never admit it. The government is also likely to double down on band-aid fixes. We may see more emergency cash injections to certain factories to clear wage arrears whenever a protest builds up, more mandates to transition workers to part-time rather than fire them, and more propaganda insisting all of these difficulties are temporary or exaggerated by Russia's enemies. Putin might personally announce some relief measures, for instance, releasing additional funds for back wages or ordering a rise in public sector pay, to show that he cares. But at this point, all these steps are only meant to buy time, not to fix what's already collapsing. Thanks for watching.